All right, Descartes and axiology. First, any and all value is found in the pure intellect and in knowledge derived from that intellect. Second, um, ultimately, virtue is the disposition of the will. Um, the will's judgment um, is either in accordance with reason and representation of the good, or it's not. And what is virtuous is that which represents the good. So when the will judges in accordance with reason and finds the good, you're going to be found virtuous. Okay? The good, since it's rooted and grounded in truth, is only to be found in the being that is true. So we can only find truth in God, means good can only be found in the truth that exists in the character and nature and essence of God. And so God's nature and essence here is the definition of what is good. Like God provides the definition to what is truth, God here provides the definition of what is good. So it's Plato's world of ideas. There is the idea, and then there is our reality. In this case with Descartes, though, take out the world of idea and substitute God. It exists perfectly the way that it's supposed to, absolutely, okay, out there with God and in God's essence and nature. So God's essence and nature establishes what is truth. God's essence and nature establishes what is good, and then we tap into that with the application of reason through what we perceive intellectually in the practice and exercise of the will. Now that's where this gets messy. So there is a virtuous thing to do, but we have to A, take in the intellectual information, B, apply reason, and then C, dispose our will in such a way as to judge in accordance with what is reasonable, because that reason is truth as we experience it within our own intellect. Because remember, for Descartes, the system is sort of self-contained. I think, therefore I am. If that's the case, then everything can be intellectually perceived and reasoned out in the human mind and then turned back around through the disposition of the will to be acted out the right way. So the good is only ever grounded in the truth, which means it's only ever grounded in God, because God defines the truth. Now, all of this matters for value for Descartes, axiology, for value, because it's that gets us into this conversation of happiness. And really, with this happiness thing, Descartes is picking up a different Neoplatonist in St. Augustine. And so happiness for Descartes is the state of mental well-being that we can achieve as we practice virtue, the right application and disposition of the will. So if we can make our intellect tranquil, guided by reason, and apply the will appropriately, we find this kind of tranquility. And it's that tranquility that he talks about as happiness. And so happiness isn't about our outward circumstance, it's literally a state of mind. And it's a state of mind that is the ultimate expression of well-being. Well-being is not all about the physical. He understands the physical will affect your mental well-being, but ultimately, well-being for him is defined as your state of mind. Okay? And so we take in intellectual information. We process it with reason, because we are rational beings, and we dispose our will to the reasonable conclusions of the intellectual information we perceive. And when we do that properly, the disposition of our will lines up with the good and lines up with the will of God. And when that happens, then we find happiness. Now, the things that get in the way are what Descartes calls passions. And there are 6 for him that interact with our intellectual information. So we take in intellectual thought and intellectual information, and we want to apply reason to them. However, the conflict in our mind, in our thought, with reason is passion. Okay, so there is either sort of dispassionate and reasonable thought or passionate thought. The 6 passions for Descartes are wonder, love, hatred, desire, joy, and sadness. And so these 6 things get in our way. Now, they're good, and we need them because they direct some of the things for our physical well-being. So, for example, the passions play a role in the preservation of our body, and they make a direct contribution to our human happiness. It is on the passions alone, says Descartes, that all the good and all the evil of this life depends. Now, what he means by that is this. When the passions work toward the good, okay, when the passions work toward the good, we do experience the good. When they don't and they work against us, we end up experiencing something evil. Okay? The passions, particularly love and joy, form a valuable part of the human question and the human life, that happiness and enjoyment consists within them as sort of a natural byproduct to virtue. And that's the kind of happiness that he values most. So here's how this works. We take in intellectual information. We apply reason and the will to make the best decision. And when he talks about the best decision, he's talking about the one most in line with God's good nature and essence. However, we have passions because we're human creatures. And sometimes those passions are really good for us because they remind us of good things. They bring clarity to some of the truth. Now, sometimes those things are bad, and they lead us away from something that is good and into something that is not. And they can get in the way of reason in the exercise of the will and kind of corrupt it. Okay? And this is the flawed part of human beings, because we can't bring in the full scope of intellectual information to counteract the passions we experience. The will can't be exercised appropriately. So if we could bring in all the intellectual information we needed, we'd be able to deal through the will and reason with our passions appropriately and act toward the good always. But because we can't, the passions will sometimes lead us to the good and sometimes push us away. So the sense of wonder that we feel in the worship of God at His greatness and His awesomeness and the fact that He is good and true and just and righteous, and that wonder we feel, and even that love we feel toward Him because of the love that He has for us, those things direct us toward the good. When we turn in hatred, now we're misdirecting some of those passions. Okay? And so what happens is some of these passions push us through the exercise of our will towards something good. Some of them push us towards something bad. Some of them will do one or the other depending on the situation that we encounter. And so our passions are good for us, but they don't always lead us to the most beneficial thing for us. Okay? Value is in the pure intellect and knowledge. Virtue comes from the way we incline our will to judge in accordance with what is good by the definition of good according to God. Okay? The passions, depending on the circumstance, either help us in that regard or they hinder us in that regard. All right. This kind of gets us through Descartes. Okay. Pretty dominantly Neoplatonist. The passions discussion makes him sound a little bit like a Stoic, but really what I think he's trying to do, especially in his Christian context, what I think he's trying to do is balance the spirit is willing but the flesh is weak, and talk about these passions that we experience in the flesh and how they relate to these things that he would probably argue relate more to the soul or the mind, which for him, soul and mind are interchangeable. Okay? So if we can get these passions that interfere with the exercise of our mind, if we can get those passions out of the way, then we're good. Or if we can use them and leverage them in appropriate ways with the exercise of our will, then we're good. The problem is we don't always do that. Okay? All right. So that wraps up Descartes. Tomorrow, or in our next screencast, we're going to pick up with Baruch Spinoza and take a hard left turn. Hopefully, if Descartes was a bit confusing for you, Spinoza make a little more sense. But Spinoza kind of drives me nuts. So I'll try and do him as much justice as I can.